Beneath the burning skies of the frontier, where silence often meant survival, a single act of kindness could echo louder than gunfire. On that forgotten trail, a young girl with nothing but a crust of bread in her hands faced a choice that would alter the destiny of many. Before her lay a warrior, torn by wounds, his strength dripping away with every drop of blood staining the dust. Around them, the land was merciless, and hunger pressed her fragile frame just as fiercely as it pressed his. Yet, instead of holding on to her last piece of hope, she placed it into his hands. That single moment carried a weight no one could yet understand. What seemed like a simple gesture, one starving soul feeding another, was in truth the beginning of a story that no tribe, no settler, and no drifter would ever forget. It was not just bread she offered. It was dignity, compassion, and the rare courage to see a warrior not as an enemy or a stranger, but as a man fighting to breathe one more day. In the West, where betrayal was easier than trust and mercy was often swallowed by fear, her decision was a rebellion against the cruelty of survival. As the night settled over the plains, the girl had no way of knowing the eyes that watched from the distance, nor the whispers that carried her action through the winds of the prairie. A small act had traveled faster than any horse, deeper than any bullet, and it reached hearts she would never meet. The West was a land of debts, both paid in gold and blood, but kindness? Kindness was the rarest currency of all. At dawn, the earth trembled under the weight of 200 footsteps. Warriors appeared on the horizon, not with blades drawn, but with heads bowed. They came not for vengeance, nor for conquest, but for gratitude. Her sacrifice had turned into a bridge no border, no scar, and no history of hatred could burn. For a fleeting moment, the wild frontier seemed to breathe differently, softer, as if even the wind itself paused to honor what had been done. This was no longer the tale of a nameless girl or a broken warrior. It became the kind of story that outlived generations. A reminder that in a land built on survival and shadowed by violence, the smallest flame of mercy could summon an army of hearts to rise in silence, in respect, and in awe. The girl's village had long lived on the edge of fear. The prairie stretched wide and merciless, and though the sun rose each morning, it often felt like an enemy rather than a friend. Hunger was constant, and danger rode in with the dust. Yet that morning after she had given her last bread away, something in the air shifted. The silence was not empty. It was charged, as though the earth itself waited to see the weight of her choice. People whispered about her bravery, others murmured of her foolishness. In a world where survival meant holding on tightly, she had let go of her only meal. The wounded warrior, once a stranger near death, lay in the shadows of the village. His chest rose weakly, but there was a new glimmer in his eyes. Each bite of bread had been a promise, not just of survival, but of belonging. For the first time in days, his gaze no longer looked toward the end, but toward tomorrow. Around him, children stared with wide eyes, trying to understand why their hunger had been exchanged for his chance to breathe. Yet they saw something in their parents' silence, a respect too deep to be spoken aloud. By midday, the girl's act had already begun to ripple beyond her sight. Hunters returning from the wild carried news that warriors had been seen watching from the ridges. They were not preparing an attack. They were not sharpening blades. They were watching, observing, waiting. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, unsure if blood or peace would be demanded by sundown. The girl remained calm, her heart steady, as though she knew mercy had already set a greater chain in motion. As the sun began to lower, painting the horizon in fire, the village grew tense. Mothers pulled their children close, fathers checked the edges of their weapons, and the elders gathered in silence. Yet in the midst of all this worry, the girl walked barefoot toward the wounded man once more. She placed her hand upon his forehead, whispering words no one else could hear. The West had always been a place where men decided fates with rifles, but that day, it was a child who carried the power to change what came next. And as the night deepened, the first sound of drums echoed faintly across the hills. It was not a call to war. It was a call to witness. Something greater than conflict was unfolding, something rare and nearly impossible in a land scarred by distrust. What began as a single piece of bread was now becoming a story no firelight could contain, a story the night itself carried into the hearts of all who listened. At dawn, the horizon glowed red, and from it came the warriors, 200 strong. They rode with discipline, their faces painted, their eyes unflinching. Yet as they approached the village, no weapons were drawn. The ground seemed to shake with the weight of their arrival, but the silence of their steps spoke louder than battle cries. The villagers braced themselves, unsure whether gratitude or vengeance rode within those ranks. The girl, however, stood at the edge of the path, her small figure unbroken before the sight of them. The leader dismounted first, his hair long, his presence commanding. His gaze swept the people, then settled on the girl. For a long moment, nothing was said. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Then, with a motion both deliberate and reverent, he bent his knee before her. The villagers gasped, for never before had such a gesture been seen. Behind him, the 200 warriors followed, bowing their heads in a single wave of respect. The child who had given her bread had now been marked with an honor beyond titles, beyond tribes. The wounded man, now strong enough to rise with aid, walked into the center of this gathering. His voice, once broken by pain, carried strength as he declared that her act had not only saved his life, but had mended a wound carved deep into the hearts of his people. He spoke of wars long fought, of blood spilled senselessly, of a hunger for revenge that had blinded generations. And then he told them that a starving girl had shown more wisdom than all the men who had wielded weapons. Tears welled in the eyes of mothers, and even the hardest warriors turned their faces to the earth, as if humbled by her courage. The elders of the village exchanged glances, realizing that something sacred had been placed in their care. This was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. In the Old West, where stories outlived men, her gesture would become a foundation stone for what was to come. From that moment, the girl was no longer seen as a fragile child, but as a keeper of peace, a bridge between two worlds. Her name, once spoken only within her small family circle, began to spread like fire across the plains. She had not raised a weapon, nor built a wall. She had offered bread, and by doing so, she had altered the very fabric of the West. As the days passed, the bond between the two peoples began to weave itself silently, like threads forming a tapestry under unseen hands. Where there had once been suspicion, now there were cautious exchanges. Hunters from the warriors' clan brought venison to the village, and in return, the villagers shared corn and dried beans. At first, hands trembled when passing food, eyes darting in fear of betrayal. But slowly, meal after meal, trust began to grow in a land where it had rarely bloomed. The girl became the heart of these gatherings. She did not speak of peace with grand words or gestures, yet every time she sat beside the wounded warrior, now recovering, her very presence reminded both sides of the choice she had made. Even the children, once too afraid to approach, began to play together, chasing each other across the dust without caring which village or tribe they belonged to. What weapons had divided, innocence was uniting. But not all hearts were ready to surrender old grudges. Some men in the village whispered that feeding the enemy was a betrayal of their father's blood. They remembered scars carved into their families, raids and burnings that could not be erased by a child's bread. Across the plains, too, there were warriors who grumbled, claiming that bowing to a little girl was a shameful act that dishonored the memory of their dead. Though peace had begun to rise, shadows of doubt threatened to strangle it. One night, while the moon painted the prairie silver, the wounded warrior called a council. He spoke not with force, but with the raw honesty of a man who had stared at death and been pulled back by mercy. He reminded both tribes that vengeance had not brought them safety, only endless graves. He said that in the smallest of acts, an act of bread, there was more power than in years of conflict. His words sank deep into the night, heavy as truth itself. The girl sat silently beside him, her small hand resting on the earth. She did not need to speak, for her silence carried more weight than all the voices combined. The warriors saw her, the villagers saw her, and in that quiet moment, they realized peace was not a dream. It was already walking among them, fragile as glass yet strong as stone. The seasons turned, and with them came changes no one could have foreseen. Where once the borderlands had been feared as places of ambush, now they became meeting grounds. Fires burned not for war, but for feasts. The warriors brought drums and songs that echoed under the night sky, and the villagers joined with flutes and chants of their own. For the first time in living memory, laughter crossed the firelight between enemies. The girl, growing taller each passing season, was treated with reverence, but also with a warmth that went beyond ceremony. Children from both sides followed her, listening to her stories, watching her quiet strength. She did not claim leadership, nor did she wear symbols of power. Her strength lay in something far more enduring, the memory of her sacrifice, the reminder that compassion could alter the course of destiny. Yet beneath the harmony, danger still lurked beyond the horizon. Outlaws roamed the frontier, men without loyalty, driven only by greed and cruelty. They saw the unity forming between the two groups not as a miracle, but as a weakness to exploit. Whispers spread of raiders planning to strike, hoping to shatter the fragile peace before it became unbreakable. When the news reached the village, fear returned like a cold wind. Old wounds ached, suspicion resurfaced, and both tribes looked at one another with doubt once again. The question hung heavy. Would this alliance stand against a common enemy, or would it fracture the first sign of danger? All eyes turned, once more, to the girl who had started it all. That night, as the flames flickered against the dark, she stood before them. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with a strength that silenced even the most hardened men. She reminded them of the day when 200 warriors bowed, not to a soldier, but to a starving child who had chosen mercy over survival. If they could honor her then, she said, surely they could honor one another now. And in that moment, hearts that had wavered began to steady once again. The warning of raiders spread quickly, carried by riders who had seen smoke trails in the distance. These were not men of honor nor warriors bound by tradition. They were scavengers, merciless and cunning, who thrived on division. Where they saw peace, they smelled opportunity. And so, while the village prepared, an uneasy silence crept back into the hearts of both tribes. Some questioned whether their fragile alliance could withstand a storm so fierce. The wounded warrior, now fully restored to strength, stepped forward. He spoke of battles fought in the past, of scars that still burned under his skin, and of the futility of endless revenge. Then, turning to the villagers, he asked them a single question. Would they rather fight these raiders alone and perish, or stand together as one and survive? The words struck like lightning, forcing even the doubters to confront the truth that unity was no longer a choice. It was the only path forward. Weapons were sharpened, not against one another, but for the first time, side by side. Warriors painted their faces while villagers bound their rifles. The fires of preparation burned late into the night, casting long shadows that flickered across the plains. And at the center of it all was the girl, moving silently from group to group, offering no weapon, no shield, only her presence, a reminder of why they had chosen to stand together. Children watched her, women whispered prayers, and men steadied their hands. They knew the dawn would bring more than blood. It would bring a test of whether compassion truly had the power to outlast violence. The girl, though still young, carried an unshakable calm in her eyes, as though she already knew the outcome of what was to come. It was not fear that guided her steps, but faith in the strength of what she had begun. And so, when the night finally surrendered to the first pale light of morning, the alliance stood ready, not as enemies forced to cooperate, but as kin forged by necessity and choice. The sound of hooves approached from the east, and with it, the test that would decide if peace could survive the merciless law of the frontier. The raiders came like a storm, their horses wild, their cries echoing like wolves in the canyon. They carried torches, blades, and greed in their eyes. To them, this was just another settlement to pillage, another people to enslave or scatter to the wind. But what they found was something unexpected. Two peoples, once divided by blood, now standing shoulder to shoulder with fire in their eyes and unshakable resolve. The first clash was thunderous. Arrows flew alongside rifle shots, spears met steel, and the land roared with the fury of battle. Dust rose thick, covering the sky in a choking haze. Yet through the chaos, the warriors and villagers fought as one, moving not as strangers, but as brothers bound by something stronger than fear. Each man defended not just his own, but the one beside him, regardless of which blood ran through his veins. The girl, too young to wield a weapon, did not hide. She stood on the ridge, holding a lantern high, its flame cutting through the smoke. To those below, her small figure was like a beacon, reminding them of what they were fighting for. Men who faltered found new strength when their eyes caught the glow of her light. In the heat of blood and steel, it was her presence that held the line together. The raiders, expecting weakness, instead found themselves outmatched, not by numbers, but by unity. For every strike they landed, they were met with a defense stronger than their greed could imagine. They began to falter, their confidence cracking as they realized this was not a divided people ripe for conquest, but a single force born from mercy and trust. When the dust began to settle, the field lay heavy with silence. The raiders, broken and scattered, fled into the wilderness, leaving behind their fallen and their pride. The alliance had held, and as the survivors looked to the ridge, where the girl still held her lantern aloft, they understood that this victory was not just of arms, but of spirit. A spirit born the day a starving child gave her bread to a dying man. In the aftermath of battle, the land carried both grief and triumph. The cries of the wounded echoed across the plains, mingling with the silent prayers of those who had survived. Fires still smoldered where torches had struck, and the ground was scarred with the weight of struggle. Yet amidst the ruin, there was something greater than loss, a bond that had been sealed in blood, not by hatred, but by sacrifice shared. The villagers and warriors walked among one another, tending to wounds, offering water, and burying the dead side by side. Old lines blurred as hands that once held weapons against each other now bound bandages with trembling care. Children who had watched the battle clung to both warriors and settlers, no longer knowing who was stranger, who was kin. In that fragile moment, they realized the war they had fought was not only against raiders, but against the divisions that had haunted them for generations. The girl, still holding her lantern though its flame was weak, descended from the ridge. The people parted for her, their faces marked with awe. She moved through the wounded, kneeling beside them, her small hands brushing away blood, her eyes carrying a strength that no child should have borne. She did not speak, but the silence around her was heavy with reverence. To them, she was more than flesh and bone. She was the living symbol of what had just been won. The warrior she had saved stood at her side, his arm bloodied, but his stance proud. He looked upon the girl with the kind of respect a leader gives to a greater leader, though she had never asked for it. Then he turned to the gathering and declared that this child had done what no man, no battle, no treaty had achieved. She had given bread, and in doing so, had given them all a future worth defending. At that moment, the murmurs began. Whispers carried through the crowd like fire through dry grass. They called her not just a girl, but a gift, a guardian, a light in the wilderness. Names that had once been spoken with doubt now carried a weight of legend. The Old West was a place where stories shaped destinies, and hers was already becoming a tale to outlive every scar. As days turned into weeks, peace began to root itself more firmly in the soil. Where there had once been boundaries marked by fear, now there were shared trails. Warriors visited the village openly, not with threats, but with offerings. Villagers ventured into their camps without trembling, welcomed as allies rather than intruders. Slowly, a new life began to grow, one where survival was no longer against one another, but with one another. The girl, though young, carried a presence that drew both peoples toward her. She did not seek to lead, yet she led by the quiet weight of her choices. Wherever she walked, the air seemed lighter, the divisions weaker. Mothers placed their infants in her arms, as if hoping her strength might pass to them. Elders watched her with guarded pride, knowing that destiny had chosen its vessel in ways men could not plan. But as her influence spread, so too did the dangers beyond. Travelers brought news of other raider bands, of lawless men who preyed on weakness. Word of the alliance was spreading across the frontier, and while some saw it as a miracle, others saw it as a challenge. Men who thrived on chaos would not allow such peace to exist without trying to shatter it. The West was never kind for long, and storms always gathered just beyond the horizon. The warrior often reminded the people that the battle they had fought was only the beginning. Peace, he said, is not a gift kept safe by chance. It must be guarded, not with fear, but with unity. His words echoed like drumbeats through every fire circle. The villagers and warriors alike began to understand that what had been forged in battle was fragile, but also worth every sacrifice to protect. And in the heart of it all remained the girl. Her story was no longer just about bread or battle. It was about a new way of living in a land where trust was rarer than gold. She had become the anchor of two peoples, and, as she walked the plains, lantern in hand, even the wild wind seemed to bend in respect. As the seasons changed, the tale of the girl spread far beyond her village and the warrior's camp. Travelers carried it across rivers, through deserts, and into towns where saloons buzzed with half-true stories of outlaws and gold. Yet whenever her name was spoken, the tone shifted. Hardened men lowered their voices, women pressed their hands to their hearts, and even gamblers at their tables paused to listen. In a world where cruelty often wrote the headlines of survival, her story was proof that kindness still had the power to command respect. Families around campfires retold the moment when 200 warriors bowed before her. Some swore the earth itself trembled in reverence. Others claimed the wind carried her name in whispers. The facts blurred, but the essence remained. The starving child who gave her last bread had become something greater than flesh. She was legend. She was memory. She was proof that the West was not just a land of violence, but also of miracles. The girl herself, however, remained unchanged. She walked the same paths, spoke with the same humility, and kept her lantern by her side. Fame did not make her proud, nor did it burden her. She was too young to crave titles, too wise to chase them. When people knelt before her, she lifted them back to their feet. When warriors offered her gifts, she shared them with children. To her, greatness was never about glory. It was about remembering the hunger of that single day and the choice she had made. Yet within the whispers of admiration, there also lingered fear. Elders warned that legends often drew enemies as much as followers. Men who lived in shadows feared the light, and her growing presence was a flame that threatened the darkness they thrived in. Some outlaws spoke openly of capturing her, believing that breaking the symbol would break the alliance. But none dared approach her, for wherever she walked, she was never alone. The warrior, now a guardian at her side, swore that no harm would touch her as long as he drew breath. He knew better than anyone that she was more than a child. She was the bond between two worlds. To protect her was to protect the fragile peace itself. And so he carried his blade, not for vengeance, but for the living embodiment of hope that walked beside him. With time, the girl's story outgrew even the plains. Songs were sung about her in villages she had never seen, and carvings of her lantern appeared in places where strangers gathered to pray for peace. The tale had taken on a life of its own, told in 100 different tongues, but always carrying the same heartbeat. That mercy, even in the smallest hand, could change the fate of many. Riders brought news that neighboring tribes, once enemies themselves, were beginning to reconsider old feuds. Farmers spoke of laying down rifles when they heard her name. Some claimed that raiders turned away at the mere mention of the girl and the warriors who followed her. Whether fact or myth, it no longer mattered. The West believed, and belief was often stronger than truth. The girl grew into her role not by seeking it, but by living it. She reminded those around her that she was not born different, not chosen by any crown or spirit. She was simply hungry, and in that hunger she had chosen compassion. That reminder struck deeper than any sermon, for it told every soul who heard her story that greatness was not reserved for kings, chiefs, or warriors. It belonged to anyone who dared to give when they had nothing left. As years stretched onward, the warrior who had once lain bleeding in the dirt became a leader known not for his battles, but for his counsel. He often said that the girl had saved his life twice, once with bread and once with meaning. For he had been a man of war, bound to hatred, until she showed him that the smallest act could outweigh the heaviest sword. And so he stood by her side, even as his hair turned gray and the frontier changed around them. And in the end, her name was carried by the wind across the wild lands. Some called her the Lantern Child, others the Keeper of Bread, but all agreed that she was a light in the wilderness. In the Old West, where so many stories ended in blood, hers endured as proof that mercy could outlast violence, and that even in the harshest frontier, a starving child's compassion could summon 200 warriors to bow in silence. Under the endless sky of the frontier, her story remained etched not in stone, but in the hearts of those who heard it. A single piece of bread, offered by a starving child, had broken through centuries of fear and vengeance. What no rifle, no treaty, no fortress could secure, she had forged with an act so simple that it became eternal. And as years passed, her light never dimmed, for legends born of compassion are stronger than any legacy of war. Her lantern became more than a flame. It was a symbol, a reminder that the West was not only a land of dust and blood, but also of miracles born in silence. Each retelling carried the same truth, that even in the harshest of places, the smallest hand could hold the greatest power. Her life whispered to all who would listen that greatness is not measured by strength or wealth, but by the courage to give when you have nothing left. In the echoes of her story, we find a question meant not for warriors or chiefs, but for us. Would we have given the bread? Would we have chosen compassion when hunger clawed at our bones? The tale forces us to look inward, to confront whether we live by fear or by faith, by vengeance or by mercy. And perhaps, in asking, we realize that the same choice rests in our hands every single day. The frontier teaches us that survival may shape us, but it is kindness that defines us. When 200 warriors bowed before a child, it was not weakness they honored, but the strength of a soul that refused to see an enemy where others saw only blood. That lesson outlived battles, outlasted storms, and still reaches across time, daring us to believe in something greater than survival alone. And if this story has moved you, if it has stirred something deep within your heart, then let it not end here. Carry it forward. Keep the flame alive by joining this community, where stories like this are told to remind us of who we are and who we can become. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this moment with others. Because just like that girl's bread, your voice has the power to nourish and inspire more than you may ever know.